So anyway, I'm so excited. I've been really so excited all day to have you on the show. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Nice to be here. Is this, should I just check, is this a kind of good enough audio? I'm not so
Yeah, you sound great.
tech. Okay,
Yeah, you
okay,
sound
good,
great.
good.
And just
Okay.
a side note is that it's not, I would say we would in the only way that we could try to like make it for the common man is a very, I don't know that it's a like scientific community to this.
It's all right. Yeah, that's fine. I'm used to talking to a general
Lay
audience.
people.
Lay people.
I mean,
Yes.
that's me. I'm pretty lay people, so but I'm really excited. So anyway, can you tell us a little bit about like how you got into this amazing and interesting line of medicine that you're in?
Sure. So look, I was I like to say, if you've seen a Woody Allen film, you'll understand my family. I come from a neurotic, argumentative Jewish family. I grew up in Australia, and I guess almost everyone in my family has had some contact with what's been defined as a mental health condition. So I went into medical school with the intention really of doing psychiatry, in that real cliche of wanting to save myself, save my family, to learn about the mind and how to fix it. Naive young man that I was.
Preaching to the choir over here. Same.
Right. Okay. Right. It's a very common story, I think. But I was also very ambivalent about medical school. I'd also had different sorts of trouble at high school. I went Australia. It's sort of it's about sunshine, outdoors, barbecue, and cricket. I was kind of the guy reading Kafka and Nietzsche in the shade, so I didn't exactly fit in at high school. That kind of led me in my third year of medical school to turn up to my GP, what's called a primary care physician, I think, in America, to say, I'm miserable, please help me. I think a lot of people back then did, and even more people these days do.
Definitely.
And it took her a couple of minutes to say, you're depressed, and why don't you try this starter pack of an antidepressant. I think she pulled out one of these sort of starter packs that the drug companies give to doctors. And I took it. I had side effects. I went back a few times. I changed the drugs around. Eventually, I stayed on one drug, Lexapro, escitalopram, which is very common in America. And I stayed on that for the next few years, the next 15 years, actually.
15.
15,
Wow.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I finished medical school. I had a lot of health problems during medical school after that. I had a lot of trouble with fatigue. I had a lot of trouble with concentration troubles, and I had a lot of memory problems. And I received various different diagnoses. I received a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, and then I received a diagnosis of narcolepsy, a sleeping disorder, and that stuck with me. And that's what I was treated for many years. I finished medical school. I started training as a psychiatrist. I thought, look, the treatments we have are not very good. I want to contribute to understanding it better. And I moved from Sydney to London to do a PhD in the biology of depression and the way antidepressants work, with the idea these drugs are useful, they could be better, we can work out how they work, we can get down to the core of it and make better drugs. And I studied the role of stress hormones and inflammation and the brain. I stared down at a dish of brain cells for several years with this idea that I could depress them by putting on stress hormones. And I imagined that they crawled into the corner and turned the lights off in their room and started listening to Radiohead. And then I would try to fix them by putting on various different drugs.
Did it work?
It was very mixed results. That's the polite way of saying it. No, the drugs didn't. In my little experiments, no, the drugs didn't seem to do a lot of good. At the end of my PhD, after I'd been on antidepressants for that point for 15 years, I read a paper that talked about withdrawal symptoms from antidepressants. And I found that shocking, basically. I had never heard about it before. I hadn't been taught about it in medical school, in psychiatry training, or in my PhD. And the first thought I had was the drugs that cause withdrawal symptoms have two things. One, you become tolerant to them. That's the flip side of withdrawal. It means they wear off over time. And two, drugs that cause withdrawal, like Valium, a benzodiazepine, or OxyContin, an opioid, aren't generally all that good for you. They tend to have a whole lot of negative effects on the brain and the body. And so I thought, should I be on a drug like this for a decade and a half? I'd never really thought about it before. I was never sure if the drugs were helping me, but I just took them because I thought it was the right thing to do. When I tried to I decided to try to come off that drug at the end of my PhD. I'm a very nerdy person, so I read all the papers written about how to come off antidepressants. They were written by the leaders in my field who I was working with, professors at Oxford and Cambridge, Harvard, and King's, where I was doing my PhD, and they all said discontinuation symptoms, which is a euphemism for withdrawal symptoms, is mild and self-limiting over a couple of weeks, and you can come off the drugs over 2 or 4 weeks. It's not a big deal. I thought, oh, that's good to know. I'm a millennial, albeit a geriatric millennial. So I went online.
Happy Geriatric Millennial Day.
Yeah, still fitting in there. So I thought I'd go online and see what other people say. And I read a very different story online.
Wow.
People said it was incredibly hard to come off. They had terrible symptoms on stopping these drugs that were often much worse than the symptoms they had when they went on the drugs. So the problems that they went on the drugs for paled in comparison to what was happening when they came off. They took months to come off, sometimes more than a year or years. They were grinding up tablets and weighing them. They were dissolving them in water in order to make small reductions. They were opening up capsules. They were counting out beads. They were, becoming kitchen chemists to get
just
off
so that
drugs.
they didn't have to have withdrawal symptoms.
To try to minimize it, exactly.
Right.
They sort of said by going down in small amounts,
right,
you can minimize the trouble.
In amounts you can't get in a pill. That small of a detox. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. Things you can't get. And I sort of thought, on the one hand, I've got these professors, and I'm a pretty institutionalized person. I've got 6 academic degrees.
Right.
I'm used to listening to professors. That's who I am. So I sort of thought, this is very strange. Strangers on the internet are saying one thing. My professors are saying something different. I didn't really know who to trust. So I thought I would hedge my bets and average it out. So I didn't take years to come off. I didn't take 2 weeks to come off. I took 4 months to come off. And I can't remember. I think I actually used some of the equipment from my PhD lab, because I was working in a, cutting edge molecular biology lab that had special weighing machines, and it had equipment. And I used that in the evenings to make small reductions. Basically, that produced the most horrifying experience of my life.
Wow.
I started to have trouble sleeping. I started to wake up in the mornings feeling like I was being chased by a wild animal, completely terrified, completely panicked in the morning. And it didn't just last for a few minutes or an hour. It lasted throughout the day. Wow. So I felt like I was having a panic attack for the first time in my life that lasted for several hours. I took up running to try to get through it. Although I wasn't the most athletic person back then. I ran until my feet bled because it gave me a little bit of a reprieve. Every day was the same. I'd wake up in utter terror. I'd spend hours and hours like that. I get a little bit of a reprieve in the evening. After several weeks of that, I thought, I can't handle this anymore. And I thought about killing myself because I just couldn't. It was just Groundhog Day, relentless, every day getting up like that. Number one, this was nothing like the Woody Allen level neurosis that had put me on the drugs. I was a
funny. I was just
pessimistic.
about to ask that. Like, were you feeling better from Lexapro? Like, was Lexapro working, do you think?
I mean, I don't know if Lexapro did very much, but comparing what the trouble that I had that put me on the drugs, I was a pessimistic, miserable young man, as accused. But when I came off, panic attacks, trouble sleeping, dizziness. It was completely out of, it was out of the normal realm of human experience. If what I had as a 21-year-old when I went on the drugs was 4 out of 10, what I had when I came off was 9.5, 9.75 out of 10. So it was a bewildering and very scary experience. I ended up actually moving back from London to my parents' house. I was I was sort of in my 30s, ostensibly a grown man, but I ended up basically on my parents' floor sobbing because I was just so, brought low by it. I ended up going back on the drugs, and I stayed there, and things improved when I went back on the drugs after a few weeks. And I sort of realized at that point that I was now on the drugs, not because they were useful to me, but because I couldn't stop them. I was in essence trapped on the drugs by the withdrawal symptoms. I'd also, in that process, because I'd read about a lot of people's experience, found out that a lot of people who were on similar drugs had trouble with daytime tiredness, concentration problems, and memory problems. And a lot of them had been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. And even I think one was diagnosed with narcolepsy. So I began to think these illnesses that I've been taught that I had, or been told that I had, maybe it was actually the side effects of the medication I'd been taking for so long.
Wow.
Anyway, I went back to working as a psychiatrist for a couple of years. I actually ended up on more drugs. I saw more doctors. They gave me more drugs for tiredness. There's a bit of a cascade where a drug led to a symptom that led to another drug for that symptom, and so forth, what's called a prescription cascade, I can see in retrospect. I decided eventually...
Were you prescribing meds too? Like, were you as a psychiatrist also prescribing Lexapro?
So I was certainly prescribing antidepressants.
Right.
I sort of at that time, I started to have some dissonance, some cognitive dissonance about it. I started to think, well, maybe that I didn't really get into it deeply because I was in such strife. I wasn't really, very reflective on the whole process. I started to think these drugs aren't quite what I had been taught that they were.
Right.
Smaller doses have much bigger effects than I had thought. There's many more side effects. I still had this idea that they were kind of useful drugs. Maybe there's just more wrong with them than I had thought. I still, I was, as a trainee, you're sort of not in the front line. You're sort of doing what your boss says. So I wasn't exactly, making high-level decisions, but I was seeing a lot of these prescriptions happening, and I was occasionally involved in it. I had more misgivings than the average psychiatrist, but I still hadn't really delved into the literature to understand, what the science about these drugs were. I've been sort of taught what I now see in retrospect was a very rosy picture of these drugs that comes out of psychiatry training, that's influenced a lot by what studies are published, which is mostly by drug companies. What I would say is an overly optimistic view of what these drugs do.
Yeah. Wow.
And just to round it off, so I decided to come off these drugs again 5 years ago, and this time I thought I knew who the experts were. Right. It was these strangers online. It was a retired software engineer and other people I'd never met, and I decided to follow their guidelines. And I came off very slowly. I'm still in the process. It's taken me years to come off what was in the end 5 drugs. As I came off, my memory, my concentration, my daytime tiredness has all improved. So, on the one hand, it's been very joyful because, a lot of things that I thought I had lost have come back. So it's been a really, a second chance at life again. So it's been a very, happy in one sense. In another sense, it's been very sad because I feel like I've wasted years on drugs that caused me trouble. The other side of things was I wrote an academic paper about what I'd learned on these websites. And it was published in a reasonably good psychiatric journal, the Lancet Psychiatry. And since then, it's led to changes in the national guidelines for how people come off antidepressants in England. So the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the equivalent of the American Psychiatric Association in England, changed its guidelines to reflect my work. And then the national health regulator that tells doctors what is the gold standard changed as well last year to reflect my work, to tell people to come off these drugs more slowly. So there's been quite a shift in in awareness of these issues in England and in guidance how to come off these drugs in a way that hasn't happened outside of England. It hasn't happened in North America. The guidelines are now completely different to the guidelines in
Really?
England.
Wow.
They're the same as they were 15 years ago. There's been no change. So there's a sort of a strange circumstance now where England and America, are in different spheres when it
You
comes
think that's
to.
because of big pharma? I mean, do you think that's just the lobbying we have here and just how much they're in charge?
Look, it's a very complicated network of influence and reputations and authority that leads to this. I mean, a part of it, yes, probably is the influence of drug companies. A big part of things, though, is the kind of threat to the integrity and authority of what are called key opinion leaders in psychiatry, the professors that become spokespeople for drug companies, the kind of the elite, who are also the professors at Harvard and Columbia and Stanford,
Right.
who have said for years these drugs are highly effective, they're very safe and easy to stop. So when evidence comes out that's contrary to that, it makes them look as if they've been misleading the public. And so there's been I think that explains why there has
That's
been
such
very
a
little
funny
recognition.
thing about pride in science, isn't it? Because isn't science sort of predicated on like when there's better information, we'll go with it? Like,
There's in medicine, there's some science, there's a lot of politics, and there's a lot of commercial influence. So science is
yeah,
one part of it.
yeah, yeah. I read something a long time ago that said that the United States is the only country in the world, except for New Zealand, who has very strict laws that allows for any advertising on television of pharmaceuticals. The only country.
Yeah, I mean, it's to people outside America when they visit America, as I have, and you see these ads on TV. It's very alarming.
Oh, yeah. After I saw that study, I'm incredibly alarmed anytime I watch television. I'm like, wow, that's so
Yeah.
true.
Yes.
So can we go back a little bit to understand like what an antidepressant is and like what you think of all of that?
So, an antidepressant is essentially a drug that has been approved by a drug regulator to treat depression. The way that you show that a drug is an antidepressant is by what's required is you put it in a 6-week trial versus
That's it?
placebo.
6
Yeah.
weeks?
So they've now reduced it to 4 weeks, but for most of the drugs, you need to have a 6-week trial. You need to have 2 positive trials. A positive trial means the drug is statistically significantly better than placebo in a 6-week trial on a depression score. So if it's a little bit better than placebo and there's 2 such studies, then the drug regulator will approve it if it passes basic safety. And I think there's a difference between what safety is from a regulator's point of view and what the average person thinks safety means. Because the reason that the regulators were set up, I know the English story much more, I think it's very similar in America, is in response to the thalidomide disaster, where people who took thalidomide, which was a painkiller during pregnancy, had children born without limbs. And so it was set up to prevent that happening. That is a little bit what the threshold for safety means. It means not producing death or major bodily harm.
Wow.
It doesn't mean it has no side effects. It doesn't mean it's a harmless drug. All drugs, there's a recent article in the British Medical Journal, all drugs have harms and some have benefits. So I'll just briefly say what the evidence for antidepressants is. If you look at hundreds of studies done for antidepressants given to a depressed person over 6 weeks, if you give them a sugar pill on a 52-point depression scale, their depression score will improve by 8 points if they're given a sugar pill and 9.8 points if you give them an antidepressant. So the difference between giving them a placebo and an antidepressant is 1.8 points on a 52-point scale.
Not much.
There's a lot of people who say that is less than clinically important difference. So it's sort of like if you show that a weight loss pill is better than placebo, but it only makes you lose 50 grams of weight, or I think in American terms, an ounce of weight. You know, it's small.
Americans would probably still take it, but I understand your point.
Right, exactly. But it has a list of side effects. You know, as long as you're
Americans would probably still take it. But anyway, right.
Okay. Americans are a good market then.
Yeah, we really are. Well, look at all of our television commercials.
Exactly. And there's a whole series of critiques of these studies, and you've got the number one, which is they go for 6 weeks. There are lots of things that might be helpful for 6 weeks, but wear off over time. So, you know, there's a whole history of drugs like Valium or OxyContin.
Yeah.
Almost any, I mean, if you drank alcohol for 6 weeks, you might have an improved, you know, mood.
Yeah.
But we know that in the long term,
right.
Exactly. We know in the long term, these things tend to wear off. They have all sorts of other trouble. So there's 520 at least antidepressant studies, and only 2 of them go for longer than 6 months. So 99% of them go for less than 12 weeks. 97% of them are done by the manufacturers of the drug that is being tested. So, you know, people have said it's a little bit like a student marking his own homework. But also the student gets a lot of money if the homework does well. You know, there are issues with publication bias. So we know that drug companies tend to publish studies that are positive to their products and not publish those that are negative, so that we're seeing a skewed version of these drugs in published literature. There's a whole host of other issues, like people who are given the drug will know they're on the drug because they'll have some side effects or changes. And that's called unblinding in these studies, that can make people expect to get better, which can make them get better. So there's a whole debate. Do these drugs really have any difference from placebo? Is there any benefit? Then there's a whole discussion about how do these drugs work? Because, you know, the word antidepressant is a little bit, I think it shortcuts people's thinking, because you hear something that sounds like antibiotic. And we sort of know antibiotics.
It's like no depression
bacteria
anymore. Right.
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's like it sort of makes you think of like it's a heat-seeking missile. It's going for the depressed part of the brain or the mind, and it's going to, you know, get rid of it.
Well, it's so magical, right? Like, oh, good, I take this pill and it's over. I mean, I do eating disorder work all the time, and I'm like, it's a journey. Like, welcome, and no one wants to listen to me, you know? Like,
yeah, that's right. Exactly, that's right. You know, there's this exactly. You talk about it's, you know, about your life and how do you change things and who are you. But, you know, why would you bother doing that if you know you don't do that for a bacterial infection? You know, you don't change your life.
You don't just like ride the journey with strep.
Exactly.
Right.
You get the anti-strep drug. So the same. It sounds the same for antidepressants, but of course it's not. You know, we don't have any drug that is targeted for negative thoughts or for the depressed part of the brain.
Right.
You know, there's a lot for a long time. The messaging from drug companies was antidepressants fix an underlying chemical imbalance. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
I'm sure. I mean, I think even though I don't take any of these and I come off of them and tell my story another day, it's like, I still think that because I'm you know, watch a lot of TV, you know?
Sure. So you're you know, you're like the average American then.
Yeah, I'm like the average American over here. Yeah.
No, actually, you're in good company, because if you survey the public, 90% of people between 80 and 90 in America or Australia think that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. And the reason why you think that is there was ads on TV for years. There's a famous ad for Zoloft.
And also, like, I'm a therapist a long time, and this is what we said in the circles, and this is what the psychiatrist said. It's not just my love of cartoons.
Okay. Yeah, you know, that's right. So it is filtered through every level of education.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's been known for a long time, I would say, in academic circles, that that's not true. You know, the chemical imbalance idea is the colloquial version of this idea that depression is caused by low serotonin, a particular neurotransmitter. That was a hypothesis put out in the 1960s by an American psychiatrist. There's been 50 years of research since then, looking at people's blood, in their brains when they die, cutting their brains up, looking at genes. And overall, there's general consensus now in the field that depression is not caused by low serotonin. We published a paper last year that summarized all of this research. that got a little bit of attention in the news because people were so convinced that it was caused by low serotonin or chemical imbalance.
Yeah.
The most common response to our paper last year by psychiatrists was yawn. This is already known. We already know this. Everyone has known for years that depression is not caused by a chemical imbalance by low serotonin. Some of them said, look, it's a metaphor we use for patients. We try to make it simpler for them to understand things, but no one really thinks that.
Oh, I think everybody thinks that. That's why they want to take pills.
Exactly. So it's a little bit, I'm not sure where the disjoint is, whether it's, unconscious or conscious being misleading. But of course, lots of people have been told by their GP or psychiatrist, the reason why you need to take an antidepressant is because it'll rectify your chemical imbalance. And of course, if you're told, you don't have enough thyroid hormone, we want to give you thyroid hormone, of course you're going to be signing up.
Yeah.
So, it's quite misleading. I don't think people took it as a metaphor. If someone told you you've got an electrical imbalance in your heart, you need a drug, and they later on said that was just a metaphor, you wouldn't take that very, happily.
What is it caused by? Like, what is the research saying it is caused by depression?
So, I get asked that question when I talk about low serotonin. My answer is, what would your grandmother have made of that sort of question? If you asked her, what causes people to be hopeless and despairing, what would she have said?
My grandmother?
Yeah.
She'd be like, you kids think too much. That's
Okay.
what she would say to me.
All right. She might have been a bit just specific.
What would your grandmother have said?
My grandma would have said, that's what happens when life is hard.
Oh.
That's when when things aren't going well, you feel depressed. She would have said.
Like more normalized it. Like, yeah, people feel sad sometimes.
Well, people feel not just sad, they can feel despairing, they can feel hopeless,
Sure.
they can feel demoralized.
Absolutely.
And the research backs up what my grandma said. If you look at the number of stresses in people's lives, divorce, job loss, physical illness, you see an incredibly, to me, it's the most incredibly strong relationships in all of the research I've ever seen. If you have none of those events, your chance of being depressed in the next 12 months is extremely low. If you have 5 of those events, it's very high. And if you have 10 of those events, it's almost 1 in 2. There's incredible gradients.
Yep.
A very common sense understanding that when, I think depression is caused by stresses in your life overwhelming your ability to cope.
Right.
Everyone has a bit of a different level of ability to cope. Everyone has different levels of stresses, or I've heard people say it's when your emotional needs are not being met, which I think is quite we all have very complex emotional needs, work, relationships, intimacy, meaning, purpose.
My shamanic teacher says it's the stop sign of the soul, which I think is the most accurate thing I ever heard. Just like, hey, look what's happening for a minute. I'm trying to tell you something. That always tracks with me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember in my lectures and textbooks, it used to talk about, depression as a brain condition that was uncaused. You hear these people who have perfect lives, but then depression just drops in their lap.
Right.
Maybe it's just me. I've never met such a person. Everybody that I have met that's been depressed has had, clear reasons in their lives. This perfectly happy person that just turns up one day and is miserable, maybe they exist out there, but that's not the general rule of what I see.
Does it have to be specific to life? I was thinking about, I was taking an ADHD test with a psychiatrist, and he said something like, are you feeling hopeless and helpless about the world? And I said, well, I understand the nature of that question given my profession, but it's a pretty hopeless and helpless world. I feel like this question should be changed, because if I'm not feeling hopeless and helpless about this world,
then you're not paying attention.
It's like a different diagnosis, right?
It's you've got obliviousness.
Right. So I think there's this existential depression, maybe that we're feeling, that if we're numbing it or we're doing something else with it or getting extra side effects from it, it's like we're not that useful. I always think about that as a therapist. Like, when people are too numbed out, you can't do the work, right? There's no change in happening when you're exhausted and narcoleptic and can't sleep and causing all these other problems. Like, we're missing the root of it.
Sure. I mean, I think there's 2 points to make there. One, if you follow people, which they did in New Zealand, they followed 1,000 people for the first 45 years of their lives.
Yeah.
86% of people will become depressed or anxious. So it's
chronically or acutely, like forever or for short.
At some point in that period of time, they've met the clinical definition of major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety. So not that they're a bit sad or a bit anxious, they've met the criteria for it. In other words, it's a near universal human experience. If 86% of people have something, it cannot be an abnormality.
Imagine if we okayed it? God, I mean, drug companies would be dead, but that would be so beautiful. I'd be so here for that.
Right. I mean, and also the natural history of depression is, it gets better by itself because people work out, they transition. If it's because they've lost a job, they find a new job. If they've lost a relationship, people work issues out. The studies also show that untreated depression of different severities have between 85 and 95% recovery in 6 months. So, there's internal memos from drug companies when they were developing these drugs saying, look, the major problem we have in this condition is it gets better by itself. It's not clear that there's a role for drugs. It's too narrow. So, the drug companies themselves understand this.
Well, and I would imagine even, I'm sure we'll get to this, but like some of the things that you would need to heal depression, connection, community, joy, interests, right? If you're like anhedonic, lack of interest and pleasure, like you need to find interest. You have to seek things, which is like the essence of spirituality. If you're thinking that this one pill is going to do the whole thing and it's causing other symptoms, that's probably pretty hard to get the healing that you need, as your story explains. My story explains. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said something very important before, that it's very hard to do the work, you said, when you're on these medications, when you're probably numbed by these, because I think that the drugs, if you ask people who are on the drugs, 50% or more will say they feel emotionally numbed on the drugs.
Yeah.
And I think there's a whole variety of different biological explanations for how these work. People talk about researching inflammation and stress hormones. None of that is very definitive. I did 4 years of work in that area. What is the simplest explanation for how antidepressants may work if they work is that more than half of people are numbed. Their emotions are numbed on the drugs. If you've got very negative emotions, well, on one of these tests that measures depression, it'll be reduced. Of course, there's no drug that's so targeted as to go just for positive, negative emotions. So you also influence emotions that we enjoy. And so, you've got this, people describe this diminished emotional life, which I definitely had. I think that relates to therapy. Therapy, not to simplify, but my understanding, not so sophisticated potentially, is getting to difficult emotions, making sense of them, confronting them. If you don't have those emotions, it's very hard to manage them or to confront them or to deal with them.
Yeah, the healing is in the feeling. That's what whenever I'm in a tough session with somebody, like I'll throw that one. Like, it's so true. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. We're actually doing some work now where we've shown that people on antidepressants have a lesser response to therapy in the long term.
Wow.
So I think that's right, that these drugs can impair people making sense of what's happening to them.
It's such a paradigm shift. Like, it hurts I know that this is true. And it's like, it's like, how do we even integrate this into our world? Talk about dissonance, talk about people being in a well-worn snow groove of belief. And then just adding pills on top of pills on top of pills. Right. I mean,
yes, it's so the ideas are very entrenched. I mean, as you said, the chemical imbalance is kind of a good example of that. It's been in popular media. It's the New York Times says it, as does lots of mainstream media. It's accepted as almost gospel. It's in medical education, so GPs, primary care physicians are saying it, psychiatrists, although.
And then it validates an experience, right? Like, if you're having a hard time and someone says, you know what, this is an imbalance. You're like, yeah, that tracks. Get me balanced. Let me take this pill. It reminds me a little bit of what's going in our country right now with Ozempic, with these weight loss injectables. And it's like, it doesn't fix everything. It sort of fixes one thing with a lot of side effects and maybe makes things worse. And yet we're still so willing to just try to put one little pin in something that needs a lot of pins in it, right?
Yeah. I mean, there is some similarities because they're obviously dealing with a complex lifestyle issue with a medication. At least the medication clearly works. I mean, which is not, you can't say that for antidepressants. I understand that Ozempic reduces body weight by 20%. It's a very big effect.
16, but yeah. Wow,
Okay,
so
compared to the sort of 1 or 2%.
Yes. Okay, fine. I'll get fine. So, you win. But 16% for a lot of unknowns and not dealing with any underlying emotional traumatic it's still the same thing.
Sure.
Like sometimes we turn to food.
A Band-Aid. I'll just say one other thing, because you've talked about how entrenched this idea is about drugs and it validating people's experience. So that's a really important point, because there is a sort of organic, well, now I think these days it's organic, that, you're stigmatizing, they say you're stigmatizing people with mental illness if you criticize, it being a chemical imbalance. And the implication is, if you're saying it's not a chemical imbalance, then you're saying it must be people's fault. They must be weak or somehow deficient. And people describe this as the brain or blame false dichotomy. If it's not the brain, then you must be blaming poor sufferers. Now, of course, I'm not doing that.
No,
I'm someone who's had depression. I've been in the same boat. I think there's a third reason, which is it's a understandable response to people's lives. You've talked about there's personal experiences in life. There's all the macro experiences, climate change and inequality and poverty and racism and you name it. So it's an understandable response to life. Most people will go through it. So I'm not saying people are weak. I still say people deserve help. I'm not dismissing people's experience, but there's this idea that if it's not the brain, if it's not neuroscience, then it's not real somehow. And I think that's a very misleading idea.
Yeah.
I think there's also, this comes back to my answer about my grandmother. There's a mix up between the brain and the mind in our lives. We're obsessed with the brain because we love science, we love neuroscientific explanations, but people become depressed, because of as a response to things in their lives. That's just, it's what mammals do. If you shock a dog, it'll lie down. If you take a monkey away from its troop, it'll start scratching itself until it bleeds. Trying to understand what is the brain, the chemical equation of that emotion, or the electrical signal of that emotion, is to me, it's a slight category error. I'll give you a bad example. It's sort of like if your Microsoft Word breaks down on your computer, you go and ask someone to open up the back of the computer to solder the circuits. Now, in one sense, your program does run in the electricity in the hardware, so it is there. But really, the solution is in the software. The guy's got to type something in it, not solder the circuits.
Right.
I think the same thing is true when it comes to our emotions. Yes, I'm not a dualist. Of course, I understand, the brain, the mind is what the brain does. Yes, it's in the chemistry and electricity of the brain. But is that the best level to understand it at? And I don't think that is. Right. Because if it's about relationships and it's about thoughts and it's about purpose and meaning, and those are mind and life level things, not brain level things. But we're in such a sort of neurophilia, we're in so much in love with complicated science.
Did you make that word up? It's so good.
No, I think it's, I'm sure I've stolen
neurophilia is just a great.
Yes, I think we've got global neurophilia.
It's very good.
And that sort of made us, I think it's confused us, because of course, if you see things as it's about a lack of connection and purpose and meaning, well, then you got to find connection, purpose, and meaning.
It's a lot of work. You tell me to take a pill and you tell me to go find meaning. I mean, right now, and I don't even take pills. I'd be like, fine, I'll take a pill. That's great.
Yeah.
That feels like
look, that was me at 21.
Yeah. Don't tell me to grieve. Can I just have a pill for it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Two questions. Number one, are we talking about the data is not the same, or is it on things like antipsychotics, or, is it the same there? Are we talking about all psychotropics, or are we just talking about antidepressants?
So it's not a small question. It's a very big question.
I know it is.
I'll try.
I'm just trying to listen to everybody disputing and wanting to shoot us on this podcast to try to say, well, it's not those, but it's this thing.
Okay. So there are some commonalities and there's some differences. I'll point out the commonality. So there's a professor of psychiatry in England called Joanna Moncrief, who I work with, who I think has very clear ideas on this topic. It's the way to understand what do psychiatric drugs do.
Right.
So there's two different ways of understanding it. One she calls the disease-centered model. And that the example I gave for antibiotics and bacteria is the disease-centered. That's a real example. Antibiotics kill the bacteria and the cough and the cold go away. Fantastic. The drug companies and psychiatrists have presented psychiatric drugs as acting in a disease-centered model. So the chemical imbalance is a great example of that. If depression is caused by low serotonin, we've got a drug that will increase serotonin. It's acting kind of like bacteria and antibiotics. That's not the case. It's not something that's that simple. I gave the example of numbing as being a way of the drugs acting. That's what she calls a drug-centered model. And the best example is what alcohol does for anxiety. If you're a socially anxious person and you drink alcohol, you will feel more relaxed and more calm, not because alcohol is reversing the underlying cause of social anxiety. We don't think social anxiety is caused by an alcohol deficiency. What we think is alcohol does certain things to it, the brain and mind, that involves calming. So it's superimposed on top of that. When you stop drinking alcohol, it'll come back.
Yeah. Worse sometimes.
And of course, and you're going to expect a few things from drugs like alcohol. You're going to expect lots of side effects. You're going to expect they may not be very good for the brain in the long term. You're going to get tolerance effects. You get withdrawal effects, a whole host of things that you wouldn't guess. For example, thyroid hormones fixing a thyroid deficiency, because that sounds very neat and normal. So she and others would suggest that psychiatric drugs may act more in a drug-centered way. That is, they produce changes in emotions and thinking that is superimposed on top of an underlying condition rather than fixing it in some way. And then the naming becomes a little bit confusing because antidepressant and antipsychotic, it sounds like they're bursting psychosis or depression.
Sounds like they're antibiotics, right?
Exactly. So antipsychotics, before they were called antipsychotics, used to be called major tranquilizers. So they emanated from, they were first used as anesthetic agents. That's how it was a surgeon doing an operation where he noticed that these drugs sedated people without putting them to sleep, that they were used as tranquilizers. A friend of his tried it in psychiatric patients, and that's how they became the class that became known as antipsychotics. So I think that psychiatric drugs are much cruder than they're said to be. They can sedate people. They can stimulate people.
This psychiatrist, you're a brave man. I really adore you, and I don't even know you. That's amazing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that there's also what patients say if you ask them.
Oh yeah.
So I should say, I'm not saying these drugs have no role, because if someone is psychotic and they're beating themselves against a wall and they're at risk to others, then being tranquilized is a very useful thing to do.
Sure.
And I think there's a role for antipsychotics, and the evidence for antipsychotics in the short term is better than the evidence for antidepressants in the short term. So I think there's a role for them. There may even be a role for some people in the long term. I'm not saying, but I also think that lens of seeing them as being sedating drugs does change what the benefits and harms would be.
Right.
So for example, there's a famous study that shows that in stable people with psychotic conditions like schizophrenia, who slowly come off their drugs, not quickly, in the long term are more likely to be back in work, living independently, living functional lives than people who stay on their drugs. And they both have similar symptoms in long-term follow-up. And so the story that I think that's telling is These drugs probably have a role in the short term. In the long term, they may not have an effective role for lots of people, and they may impair people's ability to function because of their sedating properties.
Right.
And if you've ever had a dose of one, and I've taken one,
So have
you know,
I.
it
That's what the
zombifies.
tardive
It knocks.
dyskinesia comes in. Yeah, right.
It knocks you out.
Totally.
I could barely speak. I took a tiny dose of one. I could barely speak for 36 hours.
Yeah.
So
I took one. It made me so hungry. I said, I'd rather
Right.
be psychotic. That's what I said to the
Okay.
psychiatrist.
And that's of course, so the side effects, there's metabolic effects. So
Right.
I'm certainly not saying some sort of blanket statement like all these drugs are worthless. I don't think that's true.
No.
I do think that drug-centered perspective, that the drugs are reasonably crude. They can sedate people, some of them can stimulate people, some of them can numb people, allows you to see them in a slightly more clear-eyed way, that they can have lots of adverse effects, they can have some benefits, and you should appraise that for each person. And also be thinking, like you pointed out, people become tolerant to the drugs. There are withdrawal effects from all psychiatric drugs. That includes antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, antidepressants, benzodiazepines, all drugs that you take long-term, you'll become tolerant to them. And when you stop them, you'll get withdrawal effects. So, there are downsides to all of these drugs.
To those listening who are like, by the way, my mother being one of them, who's been dying to come off Effexor for so long and can't skip a day without having shocks within her whole body. I was talking to her this morning, telling her I was talking to you. She's so excited. And all she wants to do is come off of it. And she's too scared to come off of it. I mean, my mother's 70, like you're telling the story of so many people. So if there are so many people listening here and this is like tracking in a way like, oh, great. Okay. What I think is true. And inconvenient truth is a tough thing to hold, isn't it? But, well, so what do we do? Any suggestions?
Yes, I've got a few. So there's a few broad principles about how to come off these drugs. Number one, do it slowly.
Right.
So the worst way to come off,
stop them. Don't say, oh
exactly.
God, that podcast was amazing. I'm throwing those out the window.
Yes. So please, so to anyone listening, that's the opposite of what I'm suggesting.
Right.
The worst way to stop these drugs is to throw them in the bin, quit them in one day. To me, that's like jumping off a 10-story building. Your brain is used to having this much drug in it. If you go down to zero, your brain screams out and you get withdrawal symptoms. And like your mother, you get zaps, you can be dizzy, you can have panic attacks, you can have all sorts of things that you didn't have before you went on the drugs, as well as some of the things coming back. So what makes more sense is not to jump off the top of this 10-story building, but to come down step by step. In that way, you break down, the terror of jumping off into smaller steps that cause much lesser withdrawal symptoms. To put it in people's minds, some people can come off these drugs in 3 months. Some people take 12 months. And there are certainly people out there that take 3 or 4 or 5 years because the withdrawal symptoms are so unpleasant. And Effexor, along with paroxetine or Paxil, is definitely up there as the drugs that people can take, years to come off.
Wow.
So number one, you do it slowly. Number two, do it at a rate you can tolerate. So everyone is different. Your mother will be different from me, will be different from you or anyone listening. The way to do it is to make a small reduction, see how it goes. And if that goes okay, make another small reduction, as small as 10% of the dose. The next issue is, how do you do that with these drugs? Because the tablets or the capsules are generally very large doses. A lot of my work has been on the idea that very small doses of these drugs have very large effects. So if there's a video component to this, drugs have a hyperbolic pattern of effect. Very small doses on this x-axis have very large effects on the y-axis. It's not a straight line. So it's sort of like walking down a kind of shallow path. It's fairly easy to stop, to reduce at the beginning. When you get down to lower doses, it suddenly becomes very steep and people fall off a cliff at the end because it's so steep. So you've got to go down by very small amounts, especially at the end. In order to make up these small doses, you generally need to use doses that are not easy to make with tablets that are available generally. There's a few options people use. You can use liquids. Some of the drugs come as liquids made by the drug companies. You can use a syringe and measure out small amounts. You can even dilute it with water to make it even smaller. You can A lot of the tablets you can crush and mix with water, which is perfectly normal. It's in the National Health Service in England. They've got videos telling mothers how to do that, to give small doses to their children. You crush them up. Most of them turn into suspensions. You shake it. You can use a small syringe. Compounding pharmacies make up smaller doses. Effexor is a tricky one. There's a liquid in England. I don't know if that's true in America. You can also open up a capsule, and there are little beads inside, and you can count them out. And there's 300 beads, and you can go down by 5 a week or 10 a week.
Sort of understand why people don't want to come off the meds, right?
Yeah, I mean, it involves a lot of
so much energy. Well, if you think about the brain, just like being, I mean, I guarantee so many people just blacked out during this and just said, you know what, I'll just stay miserable. It's such an interesting problem.
Yeah,
look, that it isn't made easier to come off slowly, right? It's such an interesting predicament.
Yeah. Look, it's definitely easier to start a drug than it is to stop a drug. That I can say unequivocally. It takes a second to start it. It can take people months or years. You'd be surprised how many people go to the effort of coming off in this way. There are online forums where there are tens of thousands and now hundreds of thousands of people doing this.
And you do this, don't you do this to help people?
And that's what I do this in two ways. One, I run a clinic in London in the public health system, which is what I do. And then because I ended up getting so many emails from Americans and Canadians, I've helped some colleagues to open up Outro Health, which is a digital clinic now in Canada, ideally coming to America soon, which does exactly what I said for patients. Takes them through this sort of slow taper, doing it carefully according to the way the drug affects the brain, getting them access to these drugs, monitoring them, and doing all the things to keep you well. Because around this can be a rather unpleasant experience. So we focus on all the things you can do for yourself, exercise and therapy and mindfulness. We have classes, we have therapists to help people stay well, because it can be a slightly destabilizing process.
Absolutely. But it sounds like in your story, and probably the stories of the many, does anybody regret it by the end of it?
Look, it's hard. It can be hard during it. At the end of it, my testimony is, I feel like I've got my life back from this, because I'm a very academic person. As an example, I lost my ability to think clearly. It was a very big part of me that I lost. That's come back. And I'm using it to try to push this issue forward. That's been great joy to me. I've heard a lot of other people say that they got their feelings back. People, their interests come back. They've become numb. So they've lost their interest in music, art, sport, whatever it is. So a lot of people have said they found themselves again. So I
not a small testimony.
No, that's right. Yeah. So it's for some people it's
hard work and struggle is a tough sell. It's a beautiful one. Very, very fascinating. I'm so excited at the work you're doing. I really am. As someone who made a decision a long time ago to be done with that. I said to my mom's best friend, who is a Colombian MD homeopath, I said, the psychiatrist said, well, I don't know what's wrong, so I'm just going to put you on one more antidepressant. And I said, I think I'd rather kill myself. And she said, well, how about instead of killing yourself, I help you with some natural medicine? That's what her exact words were. And it was hard coming off too. I was laying on the floor screaming. It was really tough. And I feel the same way. I feel like I had a cry session this morning with my best friend, and I was like, well, it's out now. Now I feel better. Yeah. And I just, it's a wonderful thing to have feelings and be in life, albeit this hard life we all live. So if we want to know more about what you're doing, can we find you places?
Yeah, so I've got a pretty basic website, markhorowitz.org. Outro Health is a slightly better website. It's currently only in Canada, in British Columbia. And
we'll have it all in the show notes, everybody. So no need to take your pens out.
Okay. And I'm on Twitter as well.
Oh, really? That's fascinating. It's another conversation for another time. Well, I'm really glad that we got to talk. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I'm really grateful. I hope it helps a lot of people.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks very much.